So I asked, and the Parapsychological Association agreed, if I could respond to his response. So I wrote another, something like 85-page response to it all. That never got published for a good reason, for an interesting reason. I happened to meet with Arnotton. He was now going over my thing to write his rebuttal to my new rebuttal, okay? And he was almost in tears. He said, "You said so many bad things about me in this thing here." And I said, "I didn't say anything bad about you. I just cited all of the ways you were wrong, especially in response to me. You just made up things which aren't there." And so we had this, first a little animosity, but then we began talking. I realized as we talked more and more, two things struck me. One is that he was agreeing to a lot of my major points. For example, I was surprised he was agreeing, yes, by itself, those experiments don't prove anything until we can replicate them. Already, that was a big concession.
That's a big breakthrough for a parapsychologist to admit.
Right. Yeah. And he made some other admissions. And the other thing I realized is that we were fighting over, what we were fighting over were nitty-gritty of individual experiments. Did they do it right? Did they use the right statistical tests in this case, and so on? These were details that no one but he and I were privy to, because we both had gone through this. There were, at that time, when that issue came out of the Journal of Parapsychology, all the parapsychological world was saying, "Oh boy, Arnotton has demolished Hyman. He really showed him up." The skeptics were saying Hyman has demolished Arnotton. Okay, none of these people on either side had gone through actually read the same articles.
Neither camp could actually know, because they weren't steeped in the research. It dawned on me that none of
the parapsychologists would take Arnotton's word that for what he was saying about these experiments. The skeptics were taking my word. So I knew that no one's ever going to accept, no one's ever going to go through all the work of seeing what we were fighting over, who was right or wrong on that issue. But the other thing I realized is that, hey, that's all I need to rely on. He's willing to admit that those experiments by themselves don't demonstrate the existence of psi. They have to be independently replicated.
Even though they were supposedly the best research in the field.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So I said, look, I'll withdraw my latest thing, and maybe we can do a joint article on what we agree. And so we went back and forth, and we did publish this joint communique, which said what we thought should be the case, what would be necessary in order to replicate these experiments. Of course, the follow-up from that was that, in fact, this was published in the 1950, unusual for the psychological journal to do. In 1950, about the time, the Psych Bulletin published a big article by Darrell Bem, a major parapsychologist, major social psychologist who became a friend of Arnotton's.
You said 1950? No.
1950. No, it was 1990. I'm sorry. Yeah. Okay. Okay.
Well, there's a lot we're talking about. Yeah.
No, I live in a different world, anyways. Yeah. But anyway.
Your joint communique.
A joint communique. We agreed on what should be done. Subsequently, Arnotton then finished a series of experiments, which he called the Otto-Gansfeld experiments, which he said met all the criteria we had set out, and they had replicated the original Gansfeld database. It didn't replicate at all. And I now realize that we're living in different worlds. Their notion of replicability is weird, to say the least. And by the way, the next issue, I think it'll be the next issue, or soon, one of the next issue of the Psychological Bulletin, it's going through this story all over again. They're publishing a long article by some contemporary parapsychologists showing that the Gansfeld data, the latest Gansfeld data, replicate the original Gansfeld and the original ones, okay? And they do what was called meta-analysis, which is another word for voodoo, okay? And so this being published in the Psychological Bulletin, but they asked me to comment on it, and it is the worst stuff I've ever seen. I mean,
wow.
At this point, after 50-something years, I lost my patience. This is BS, okay?
Well, in fact, that gets to the question where possibly I was putting words in your mouth, who knows, but where the implication of what you're saying sounds to me like it's all a fool's errand. Having a few experts really look at the parapsychology research, you never really engage with the parapsychologists. They have their camp that believe their leaders. The skeptics, without knowing the research, have their kind of skeptic heroes that they just believe in, without being steeped in the research. And so are you suggesting that that's not the best approach when responding to these sorts of claims?
Well, it's not as simple as that. And what happened to me was I've decided I had this epiphany, and epiphany is not the word that you should use in my context, but I'll call it an epiphany anyways. It wasn't all of a sudden, though. It was gradual. It dawned on me, beginning with that joint communique, it dawned on me that I had made a terrible mistake in one sense. I had focused on the flaws and the statistical shortcomings of what parapsychologists were doing. And I was showing that was my goal at that time, was showing that because of all those flaws, they can't use this as evidence for anything until they clean up their act. I realized that's wrong. At some point I realized that was a wrong approach. The main reason, I won't give you all the reasons, but the main reason it's a wrong approach is because focusing on the flaws in their experiments switched the burden of proof from them. Remember, they're the one that should be trying to prove something, not me. But they immediately, the whole 1985 issue of Journal of Parapsychology devoted to that debate between Arnton and myself is focusing on flaws. Did this experiment have these flaws? Or did these statistical flaws? And if they did have these flaws, did these flaws make a difference? And I think that was a wrong mistake because everyone was focusing on that. And that's not the issue. Whether they have flaws or not, the issue is, can they independently replicate those? And they cannot. And that's something you don't need to be a fancy statistician or study their literature in detail or be a good experimentalist. All you have to realize is that it's a necessary thing, regardless of what you think science is or is not. And there are a lot of people who make their living by writing books, philosophers of science, they're called themselves, and historians of science. They write books on what is science, what isn't science, and stuff like that. But regardless of that, a necessary condition for something to be science, not a sufficient, but a necessary condition is that you've got to have something, you've got to have a subject matter. And science, since the early days of Galileo, Newton, and so on, has survived and done so well because it only deals with data that can be independently replicated. That's how you know there's something there. Well, parapsychology doesn't have doesn't have something there. They can't replicate. And even some of the major parapsychologists today are claiming that, in fact, parapsychology cannot produce the kind of evidence that science requires.
So they want to lower the bar. They still believe in parapsychology.
You're jumping the gun, but you're taking the words out of my mouth, but that's why you're here.
That's my psychic powers.
Okay.
Yeah, don't tell the skeptic audience.
No, that's fine. Okay. Yeah. No, that's fine. I'm glad you did that.